Thank you very much, Geertje, and thank you very much for inviting me again to this summer school. So we was here 3 years ago, and I thought it was one of the most exciting summer schools I've ever been to, and it's also one of the few places where I think there's genuine interdisciplinary work done on resources and resource conservation. Now, most of the presentations we've seen so far has been about mining or issues related directly to mining. I'm going to do something completely different. So as some of you know, my background is in psychology, and basically what I'll do in this presentation is to give you a flavor what psychology can do in terms of using fewer resources in terms of energy and materials. And the focus I will have in this presentation will be on behavior change, because we often hear that in order to deal with issues we need individuals to change their behavior. Now, I will make an argument for that, but I will also make an argument against that. Yeah, so it is a little bit a complex issue, and it's an evolving field because it's quite complicated actually, and I hope I can formulate that clearly. So just a little bit about the structure. So first of all, a little bit about resource conservation, so why psychology is important. Then I'll say something about different models of behaviors, again to give you a flavor. What kind of models are there out there in psychology? So what kind of models do we work with? Then I'll say something about behavior versus behavior change, which is not necessarily the same thing. Yeah, so the factors in behavior are not necessarily the factors you need in order to change behavior. Because you need levers to change behavior. And then I'll say something about different types of interventions that you could do to change behavior before I come to a conclusion. Now, the reason why psychology is important for resource conservation is because almost anything and everything we do we consume materials and energy that needs to be extracted, processed, and often transported over larger distances. Yeah? Now, this consumption leads to different kind of problems, and most notably climate change. And climate change is also the topic I usually work with. But there's other environmental issues like waste accumulation or air pollution, habitat destruction, and things like that. And they're all interrelated in terms of global environmental change. Now, in order to get to net zero, in order to mitigate climate change, we need behavior change. Yeah, so often we hear about the decarbonization of energy, and we've been really successful in that, or certain countries have been really successful in that. But only supply side changes is not sufficient. Yes, there's many aspects to climate change. It includes energy, but also includes land changes, for example, and they are linked, for example, to diet. And the Climate Change Commission in the UK, they have shown that more than half of all the measures that are needed to get to net zero involve some kind of behavior change or need some kind of involvement of individuals. And even more than that, if you include changes in organizations, for example, so within industry, there's also individual changes that need to be made. So behavioral sciences therefore have a role to play. That's where psychology comes in. But it's also important to note that there are limitations. Yeah, so policymakers always think like, well, behavior change, and then it's done. But it's, of course, not that simple. Now, what I will do is to give an overview of behavior and behavior change theories and models, and then possible contributions, and I'll try to put that into a wider context. Now, there's lots of different models. Yeah, this is just a list that has been collated by Tim Jackson quite some time ago. And you can see that I've got different types of brackets because there's different types of models of behaviors. There's specific models of environmental behaviors. Some are more psychological, some are more sociological, for example. Yeah, so there's models of reasoned behavior, there's models of moral and normative conduct. Now, they are quite different in terms of what they say about why we behave in a certain way. And there's also integrated models. Now, I can't talk about all of them because I've only got 30 minutes, so I've selected a few of them, so the ones that are most used within the literature, so which you can see here. Now, to start with the theory of planned behavior. Now, this is probably the most used model in psychology, And I don't think I exaggerate. It's more than hundreds of thousands of papers have been written with this model. It has been applied to absolutely everything. Yeah? And this is a general model of behavior. So it's the idea that, you know, in order to behave in a certain way, we need to plan it. Yeah? We need to deliberate about it. We deliberate things, and then we decide whether we want to behave in a certain way or not. Has to do with our attitude. So how do we feel about a behavior? How do we feel about driving a car? How do we feel about cycling, for example? But it's not only about how we feel about behavior, it's also about how other people feel about that behavior. Yeah, so smoking, for example, can be socially unacceptable. Yeah, so you might like it, but if your friends and family don't like it, you're less likely to engage in it. And then finally, there's the perceived behavioral control, is the perceived ability to perform that behavior. Do we feel able, you know, do we have the capability to perform a behavior? Now that leads to an intention, you know, whether you plan to do a behavior or not. And you can see here there's a link between the two, so intention and behavior. And you may have heard about the intention-behavior gap. Yeah, it's the difference between what we say and what we do. Yeah, the value-action gap. Yeah, that is really nicely shown with this particular model. Now, there are also more specific behavior of models about environmental behavior. So the idea is, well, if we want to do good for the environment, it's because we need to have a moral kind of perspective on it. Yeah, so the idea of the value belief norm model, and it says exactly what, well, it does exactly what it says on the tin, is that behaviors, environmental behaviors, they are determined by our values, beliefs, and norms. Yeah, so everything goes back to what we find important in life. Yeah? Do we find it important to be successful? And that drives our decisions. Yeah? Do we, are we more socially oriented? Again, that drives our decisions. Yeah? It leads to different kind of worldviews, so how you view the world. And you know, if you're, let's say, focused on, let's say, the environment, environmental quality, then you basically you fear what you value, yeah, and then you may be aware of the negative consequences of your own behaviors. Now, if you then also feel responsible for those outcomes, then you develop a personal norm. So how you feel yourself, you ought to behave. Yeah? You are concerned about the environment, and that is what drives your behavior. You feel responsible to act in the right way, and it can lead to different kinds of behavior in terms of what we consume, but also in terms of environmental activism. Yeah. Now, there's other models. Now, this one is quite simplistic, but also quite elegant. And the idea is that our behavior is not only determined by our attitudes, but also by the context, the environmental conditions we perform the behavior in. Yeah, and if they're both positive, then you're more likely to engage in that pro-environmental behavior. If you're quite negative on both dimensions, it's less likely you will behave in that way. But there is a trade-off between the two. Yeah, so it can be that the external conditions are negative, but because you're very motivated to act in a certain way, you can still be on the green side of this slide, but also vice versa. Yeah, it could also be that you don't care too much about the environment, but because of the external conditions being very favorable, you still engage in that type of behavior. And that's quite nicely shown by this study by Guagnano and colleagues. It's about recycling. You may recognize these aspects. So these attitudinal aspects is about ascription of responsibility, and that is linked to recycling behavior. Now, what is most important here is that it's not only attitudes, it's also the context, it's the provision of bins. Yeah? And it is far more important than attitudes. Yeah? Even more important than that is that there's an interaction between the two. If there's no bins, then attitudes are predictive of the behavior. If there are bins, attitudes are completely irrelevant because everybody recycles. Yeah, so curbside recycling is a very good way of motivating people to recycle. But behavior is complex. There's so many different factors involved in our behavior, And this is just an example. So often, people chuck all these factors together, and this is how we behave. Yeah? So there's intentions, there's perceived behavioral control, there is ascription of responsibility, there's attitudes, there's habits, there's absolutely everything. But it's even more complex than that. Yeah? So this is the Foresight obesity system map. Yeah? It's not only psychology, it's also social influence. Is the systems of provision in terms of food. Yeah, what food do you have access to? The activity environment. Is it easy to be active or not? So all these aspects, they contribute to obesity, to problem. Yeah? Biology, there's biological factors underlying all that. Yeah? Now consider how complex this is for obesity, and consider how difficult it is to address climate change. It's even more complex than this. So what do you do? How do you change behavior? Yeah? Also important to consider is that behavior is not the same as behavior change. So you've seen a number of factors, lots of different factors. Yeah? Now, they underline behavior, but they are not necessarily the factors that contribute to behavior change. Because behavior change is a process. It's a reiterative process. Yeah, so if you want to stop smoking, well, you first need to contemplate it. If you don't contemplate it, you can do whatever you like, but probably this person will not change their behavior. Yeah? And there's different factors in each of these different stages. And there may be relapses. You may try to, but then you relapse, and you try again, and you relapse again. Yeah? All these things may happen. So it's a process, and it's to find out how to make progress in that list, right? How do you get to action and how do you get to maintenance? Now this is the behavior change wheel, and this is by Susan Mitchie and colleagues. And what they try to do is to capture both the factors that affect behavior, but also what you can do in order to change that behavior. Yeah, so if you're looking at the middle, the green bit, that's about capability, opportunity, and motivation. So these are the factors that underlie behavior. So are you able to perform a certain behavior? Do you have the opportunity to behave in a certain way? And do you have the motivation to engage in it? And you need the combination of the three. Yeah? And then the outside, that is where you've got the levers. Yeah? So policymakers, they need to do something. Yeah? They can legislate, they can regulate, they can provide services in order to change people, their behavior. Or you can make changes to environmental planning, for example. Yeah, so this is actually quite nice about these two, about this model, is that it tries to link policy with behavior change itself. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on. Now, when you're looking at interventions to change behavior, often a distinction is made between downstream and upstream interventions. Yeah, and upstream, downstream, it's more about how close is it to the individual. Yeah, so downstream interventions, what you're trying to do is to make the person make certain choices. Yeah, you try to influence the behavior quite directly. And in most cases, that is a provision of information. Yeah? Education, yeah? Information, signage, things like that. And then you hope people will change their behavior. Upstream, it's much more about a context. So if you're looking at the Foresight obesity map, it's more about food provision, activity environment, so these kind of things. So upstream, you try to change the structure within which decisions are being made. Yeah, so to make it impossible or to motivate certain kind of behaviors. There's different kinds of things that you can do there. Now, in terms of downstream interventions, now psychologists absolutely love this. Yeah, because this links to the theories we've seen before. So the theory of planned behavior or the value belief norm model. Yeah, so what you can try to do there is to provide information to influence those factors that you will find in these behavioral models. So you can try to change people their attitudes, for example. You can try to change people their perceived behavioral control. You can try to provide information about what is normal and what is expected, and then you hope people will make different decisions. Or you try to appeal to values. You know, what do you do it for? You know, why do you behave in a certain way? Now, at the bottom, there's a few examples that impact on those different aspects. Some of them are pretty dodgy, I think, but that's the one that I found on the internet. Yeah, so this, for example, is bin your litter. It's a pretty quick thing to do. Now, apart from it being, in my view, quite inappropriate, what they're trying to do is they try to communicate that it's easy. Yeah, so you try to appeal to this idea that you have behavioral control. It's an easy thing to do, and then hoping that will make people change their mind. The one in the middle you will probably have seen before. Yeah, it says bin your litter, others do. Yeah, and that communicates what the social norm is. Other people behave in that way, so why shouldn't you? And social norms are very powerful in that sense. Yeah. And on the right, this appeals to values. So what are you doing it for? It's for a clean environment, and it's about being nice to other people. So then you get experiments like this. So this is about idling at a junction. And what you can do at a junction is you provide a sign, and you say, well, please switch off your engine. And as you can see here, there are different types of messages, and they are linked to the theory of planned behavior. And so it's efficacy linked, perceived behavioral control, norm linked, intention linked, and then you have a baseline control. And then they have different levels of efficacy, right? So here you can see that all of them work, and some are more effective than others. You may also be familiar with this one. So if you've ever stayed in a hotel, sometimes you find messages saying that, well, reuse your towel, and it really depends on what kind of message you provide, whether people are willing to do that or not. You can just say, well, you can do it for the environment, but you can also say the majority of guests in this particular room, so the same room as you're sleeping in now, they use their towel again. Yeah, so it's again to provide that social norm. What is normal, what is not. However, if you look at the effects of those types of behavioral interventions, they're actually quite small. We always see these examples, hey, we have massive changes in terms of behavior. Actually, in most cases, they don't. Yeah? And this is actually quite a difficult graph, I think, but what this shows is that in the 70s and in the 90s, when we did experiments, they produced an effect. But over the last 10, 20 years, almost any experiment has a tiny effect. Yeah? You get change, effects are very, very small. Yeah? So what Nisa and al. Concluded is that, well, actually, they have small effects, and there's no evidence that they remain effective. Yeah? And certain things have been shown not to work. Information, hoping that people change their behavior, don't try it. Don't waste your time and effort. Yeah? Other things, like nudges, they are more effective. Yeah? And that is about choosing the normal choice. That's a choice architecture. Right? Now, let's move to upstream interventions. Yeah? So this to change the context in which decisions take place. Yeah? It's about structural change. Investment in infrastructure, for example, regulation, as we've heard this morning, is one way to do it, and nudging. So a few examples there. Now, nudging is not about changing anything substantial, but it's changing the default. Yeah, so for example, if you have a pension and you have a new job, do you enroll automatically or not, or do you need to sign up? It really makes a difference what you choose. Yeah, so if you start out with a pension, but you have to explicitly say, I don't want a pension, far more people choose the pension, yeah? And vice versa. But also with, for example, the availability of vegetarian meals. If you make more meals available, more people will choose it. It sounds obvious, but actually it does work. And even the most meat-eating person will choose more vegetarian meals. The only thing you have to do is to provide more options, yeah, more meal options. But there's other things you can do. You can provide the vegetarian option first. Yeah, so you come to the cafe, The first option you see is a vegetarian meal. Well, you're hungry, you say, well, that looks nice, I choose it. And then you walk 1 or 2 meters further, there's meat, and say, well, I've already made a choice. Shows that it's highly effective. Providing it first. The only thing you have to do, it's not changing the provision, but changing the structure of the provision. Right? Very simple interventions, a bigger effect. Infrastructure. Very important. As I said before, providing information is not enough. Cycling, you can tell, look, it's healthy, it's good for the environment. But if you don't have a safe environment to do that, a lot of people won't cycle. So what do you need to do is to provide safe infrastructure. And I'm originally from the Netherlands, and if you're looking at the infrastructure there, it's absolutely amazing. Anywhere you go, you can cycle. There's separate, cycle paths. But also in other areas, so in Bogota, Colombia, for example, there's the Ciclovia. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's on a Sunday, I believe, and then, it's all traffic free. That's correct, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Lots of people use this. Yeah. It's safe to cycle. It's a complete different environment. Yeah. And also the idea that the Dutch, that they're inherently, cyclists. It's not true. They cycle because they have that infrastructure over there. Yeah. So what do you need to do to get people to cycle is to improve infrastructure, restrict car use, and then perhaps also do a little bit of education in there. Yeah, combine them all. Yeah. And that is very effective. Not only information, you need to do more than that. Yeah. And you often hear that, we're not like Amsterdam. Amsterdam wasn't like Amsterdam. Go back to the 1970s, it was, car dominated, very unpleasant. Yeah? But political decisions were made here over a very long period. It took 20, 30, 40 years to get where we are now. Yeah? It's not happening overnight. Yeah? You need investment, you need to have politicians on board to make these changes. Other things, economic instruments, they can be surprisingly effective. Yeah, so you may have heard of the Plastax here in Ireland, but also the carrier bag charge or the plastic bag charge in England. 5p on every plastic bag, only 5p. Very big change. Yeah. This doesn't look impressive, so this is in England, before, after, and follow-up. Doesn't look like a massive change, but 85% less plastic bags. The only thing you had to do is to put 5 pence on a plastic bag. Yeah. Now, that's not only an economic instrument, it's also a psychological instrument, right? So what you do with a 5p is that you disrupt the behavior. You make people think about why they need a plastic bag or not. You can have very big changes, very little thing to do. Yeah? Same with coffee cups, something we did with Bewley's, a company here in Ireland. Again, we found that financial incentives, they do work, yeah? But you need a charge. Yeah? A discount generally doesn't work. Yeah? So you need to disrupt this idea that you need to pay extra for the environmentally less sustainable option. Does it always work? No. And this is again by Garnett et al. It's what I've shown you before with the vegetarian options. They also try to increase the price of meat options and then make vegetarian options cheaper. No effect whatsoever. Yeah, so it's not about price here. And again, that's because the price, you don't see it. You need to see it. You need to feel it. If you don't see it, if you don't feel it, it won't have any impact. Now, what does this tell us all? Well, changing behavior for resource conservation is hard. It's very, very hard. Yeah, as I said before at the beginning, policymakers, they like behavior change. They love behavior change because they think, well, we do a little intervention and people change their behavior. They don't. Yeah? So psychological approaches, and I have to be careful because I'm a psychologist myself. They can be useful, but when you take them in isolation, they have very tiny effects. Yeah, and that is something you need to consider. Yeah. Certain things work better than others. So as I mentioned, signers and nudges, they can work in very specific circumstances. Just providing information, don't bother, basically. Yeah. But you can do it in combination with lots of different things. So think about it as a policy. Think about it, let's say, what do we need altogether to change people, their behavior? Now, also, psychology and behavioral intervention, they're very good at changing specific behaviors. So if you have plastic bags, you can change that. Yeah? And actually, it's quite simple to do that. Coffee cups, you can take certain kind of measures that work. If you want to transform to a low-carbon society, much more is needed. And now within the literature, there's this big discussion about, do we need system change, do we need behavioral change? Actually, what we need is both. Yeah, so you can't have behavior change without system change, and you can't have system change without behavioral change. Yeah, and that's actually quite difficult to do. So that's it for me today. So Joel van Vouwer, thank you very much.